The person you ignored today might hold the key to everything you've ever lost. A single act of kindness, a gesture so small it feels insignificant, could unravel a lifetime of pain and rewrite the future. This is a story about a woman with nothing, who chose to give everything she had, and a man who had everything, but felt he had nothing left to lose. It's a story about how the past never truly leaves us, and how sometimes the only way to find yourself is to be found by someone else. We love seeing how far our stories travel, so please let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul, subscribe to our channel for more. The rain fell in relentless, slanting sheets, blurring the world outside the diner window into a watercolor of neon and shadow. For Lila, it was the sound of another long Tuesday coming to a close. Each drop that splattered against the glass was a tick of the clock, counting down the minutes until she could trade her stained apron for the damp chill of the bus ride home. Her feet ached with a familiar, deep-seated throb, a pain that started in her heels and worked its way up her spine, settling into a permanent knot of tension between her shoulder blades. She moved through the greasy air of the corner skillet with an economy of motion born from years of practice, clearing plates slick with ketchup and refilling coffee cups for the last of the stragglers. The diner was a small universe of familiar faces and quiet desperation, a place where people came to escape the rain or the silence of their own empty apartments. Lila knew their orders by heart, their stories by the look in their eyes. She was a silent keeper of secrets, a fleeting part of 100 different lives, yet her own felt impossibly small, contained within the four walls of this diner and the tiny two-bedroom apartment she shared with her daughter, Maya. Tonight, the tips were light. The rain kept people home. She counted the crumpled bills and loose change in her apron pocket, a meager collection that wouldn't even cover the overdue electricity bill tucked inside her worn-out wallet. A familiar sigh escaped her lips, a small cloud of steam in the cool air. It was a sigh of acceptance, not despair. Despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. Through the rain-streaked window, under the flickering crimson buzz of the diner's sign, she saw him. He was a fixture, a ghost who had appeared a few weeks ago, haunting the periphery of her world. He wasn't like the others who sometimes sought shelter under the awning. He never asked for anything. He just sat on the cold, wet bench, a statue of forgotten grief, his shoulders slumped against the relentless torrent. He was thin, his face obscured by a matted beard and hair that was plastered to his skull by the rain. His clothes were threadbare, a patchwork of damp grays and browns that seemed to melt into the gloom of the alleyway beside the diner. But it was his eyes that held her. On the rare occasions he looked up, his eyes were not vacant or wild, but filled with a profound, crushing emptiness, a hollowed-out look that spoke of a loss so deep it had carved out his very soul. Other servers ignored him. The owner, Gus, a man whose heart had hardened in tandem with his arteries, would shoo him away if he got too close to the door. But Lila couldn't. She saw in his stillness a reflection of her own exhaustion, a different kind of poverty that had nothing to do with money. She saw a story, and her heart, already so full of its own burdens, made room for his. She felt an inexplicable pull, a quiet but insistent voice in her head, the same voice that sounded so much like her late husband's, whispering a simple, powerful truth. No one deserves to be invisible. Lila glanced at the half-eaten sandwich on a plate in the kitchen pass-through, her own dinner, which she had been too busy to finish. It was simple. 2 slices of day-old bread, a smear of mustard, and a single thin slice of turkey. It wasn't much, but tonight, it felt like a feast she couldn't possibly eat alone. She thought of Maya, safe at their neighbors, probably drawing pictures of smiling suns and colorful rainbows, oblivious to the storm outside and the quiet storms raging inside the people around her. That thought solidified her resolve. She wanted to build a world for Maya where kindness was the default setting, not the exception. She took a deep breath, untied her apron, and grabbed the plate. Gus grunted from behind the register, not even looking up from his crossword puzzle. "You heading out, Lila?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "In a minute, Gus," she said softly. Her heart was beating a little faster now, a nervous flutter in her chest. She wasn't afraid of the man, but of the interaction itself, the bridging of the vast chasm between her world and his. It was easier to look away. It was always easier. But tonight, she chose the harder path. With the plate in her hand, she pushed open the heavy glass door of the diner, the bell above it, jangling a cheerful, almost mocking, tune as she stepped out into the cold, unforgiving rain. The chill hit her instantly, seeping through her thin uniform. But she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the man sitting on the bench. He didn't move as she approached, his gaze fixed on a puddle forming at his feet, the reflection of the neon sign swirling in its murky depths. He seemed to have retreated so far into himself that the outside world had ceased to exist. Lila hesitated for a moment, the rain dripping from her hair onto the plate. What was she even doing? This was foolish. The man probably wanted to be left alone. She could just leave the plate on the bench and walk away. But that felt wrong, like an incomplete sentence, an act of charity without the dignity of connection. She took another step forward, her worn-out sneakers squelching on the pavement. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the downpour. The man didn't react. It was as if she hadn't spoken at all. She cleared her throat and tried again, a little louder this time. "Sir?" She was standing directly in front of him now. Slowly, as if moving a great weight, he lifted his head. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were startling. They were a piercing, intelligent blue, though clouded with a deep, ancient sorrow. In that moment, he wasn't just a homeless man. He was a person, stripped bare of everything but his pain. The sight stole the air from her lungs. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers connected by the rhythm of the falling rain. The world around them seemed to fall away, the rumble of a passing truck, the distant wail of a siren, the buzz of the sign above them. There was only the quiet intensity of his gaze and the unsteady thump of her own heart. Lila had forgotten the words she had planned to say. All the polite, careful phrases evaporated, leaving only the raw, simple truth of the moment. She extended the plate towards him. I didn't finish my dinner," she stammered, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "It's not much, but I thought you might be hungry." The man's eyes flickered from her face down to the humble offering on the plate. The half-sandwich looked small and pathetic under the vast, weeping sky. He didn't move. He didn't speak. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Was it suspicion? Confusion? Pride? Lila's arm began to tremble slightly. From the cold, or from the emotional weight of the moment, she couldn't tell. She felt a flush of embarrassment, a hot wave that defied the cold rain. Maybe she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe she was insulting him, offering her pity when all he wanted was to be left alone in his misery. She started to pull her hand back, a quiet apology forming on her lips. But then, his hand moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, his fingers, chapped and raw, reaching out and gently, so gently, taking the plate from her. His touch was surprisingly light, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. It was a spark of human contact that felt strangely intimate in the cold, impersonal rain. He held the plate in his lap, his head bowed over it as if in prayer. He still hadn't said a word. Lila stood there, unsure of what to do next. The transaction was complete, yet it felt unfinished. She should go, catch her bus, get home to Maya, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She watched as he picked up one half of the sandwich. He didn't devour it like a man starved, which she had half expected. Instead, he took a small, measured bite, chewing slowly, deliberately, as if savoring a memory rather than a meal. The rain continued its relentless assault, plastering her hair to her face and soaking her uniform through to the skin, but a strange warmth was spreading through her chest. It was the warmth of a shared humanity, a connection forged in a moment of vulnerability. It was a feeling more nourishing than any meal. She finally found her voice again, though it was still shaky. "My name is Lila," she said, offering another piece of herself. The man finished his first bite, and then, for the first time, his voice emerged. It was a hoarse, raspy sound, rough from disuse, but it held a surprising depth, a remnant of a former power. "Arthur?" he said, just one word. He didn't look at her when he said it, his gaze still fixed on the plate, but he had given her a name. He had let her in. Just a crack. It was more than enough. Lila finally managed a small, genuine smile. "It's nice to meet you, Arthur," she replied. A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the drumming of the rain. He took another bite of the sandwich, and she felt her shoulders relax for the first time all day. The knot of tension began to loosen its grip. She wasn't just a waitress, a single mother, a woman struggling to make ends meet. In that moment, she was just Lila, sharing a moment of quiet grace with a man named Arthur. She knew she should leave, but something held her there. It was a feeling of responsibility, of not wanting to abandon this fragile connection the moment it was formed. She pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "The rain is really coming down," she said, stating the obvious, just to fill the silence. Arthur simply nodded, his focus still on his meal. This small act of giving had shifted something inside her. The exhaustion was still there. The worries about the bills hadn't vanished, but they were now joined by a different feeling, a sense of purpose, however small. She had done one good thing in a day full of hard things. She had chosen connection over indifference. It was a choice her husband, David, would have been proud of. The memory of him brought a familiar pang of grief, but tonight it was softer, mingled with the warmth spreading through her chest. David had always said that you measure a person's wealth not by what they have, but by what they give away. As Arthur slowly ate, Lila's mind drifted back 5 years to a different rainy night. She and David had been driving home from a rare dinner out, celebrating their anniversary. They didn't have much money, but David had saved for weeks to take her to a little Italian restaurant downtown. He was like that, always finding ways to create magic out of the mundane. On the way home, they saw a family stranded on the side of the road, their car's hazard lights blinking in the downpour. David, without a moment's hesitation, pulled over. Lila had been nervous, the stories of roadside dangers playing in her head, but David just smiled his easy, reassuring smile. "They need help, Lee. That's all that matters," he'd said. He spent the next hour in the pouring rain with the father, figuring out that it was a simple fix, a disconnected battery cable. He got them back on the road, covered in grease and soaked to the bone, but beaming. He hadn't asked for anything in return, just waved them off with a smile. Later that night, curled up in their warm bed, he had held her close and whispered, Kindness is the only currency that never loses its value, Lila. It's the only thing you can give away and end up with more than you started with. Those words had become her mantra, the legacy he'd left her when he was taken from her by a sudden illness just a year later. They were the words that propelled her out into the rain tonight. Arthur finished the last bite of the sandwich and carefully placed the empty plate on the bench beside him. He still hadn't looked at her again. Lila felt a pang of disappointment. She had hoped for something more. A thank you, maybe. Another word. A glance. But there was nothing. Just the same crushing emptiness she had seen before. Perhaps she had imagined the connection. Perhaps it was just a transaction after all. Food in exchange for a temporary reprieve from hunger. The cold she had been ignoring began to seep into her bones now. A deep, weary chill. The bus would be coming soon. She had to go. "Well," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet alley. I should be going. My daughter is waiting." She turned to leave, the feeling of warmth from before now extinguished, replaced by a familiar sense of foolishness. She had tried. That's what mattered. She took a step away from the bench, back toward the harsh reality of her life. But then, his voice, that same raspy whisper, cut through the sound of the rain. "Wait." Lila froze, her back still to him. She slowly turned around. Arthur was finally looking at her, and this time, his eyes were different. The emptiness was still there, but in its depths, a tiny flickering light had been kindled. It was faint, fragile, but it was undeniably there. He was looking at her, truly seeing her. He gestured with his chin toward the empty plate. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. It was more than just a thank you for the food. It was a thank you for seeing him, for speaking to him, for treating him like a human being. Lila's heart swelled. "You're welcome," she whispered, a real smile returning to her face. He then did something that surprised her. He reached into the pocket of his tattered coat and pulled out a small, misshapen object. It was a little bird, carved crudely from a scrap of wood. It was rough and unfinished, but it had a certain charm, a simple elegance. He held it out to her. "For your daughter," he said, his voice still a low rasp. Lila stared at the wooden bird, momentarily speechless. It was a gift. This man, who had nothing, was giving her a gift. It was a profound, humbling gesture that struck her to her very core. She reached out and took it, her fingers closing around the smooth, worn wood. It was still warm from his pocket. I can't," she stammered. You shouldn't." Arthur simply shook his head, a gesture of finality. "Kindness should be returned," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. And then he looked away again, retreating back into his shell. The brief connection severed. The conversation was over. Lila clutched the small wooden bird in her hand. It felt solid, real. It was a talisman, a proof that the moment had been real. She looked from the bird to Arthur, who was now staring at his feet again, the statue of grief once more. She knew there was nothing more to say. She had to go. "Thank you," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if he heard her. She turned and walked away, not looking back this time. As she walked to the bus stop at the corner, the rain began to subside, slowing to a gentle drizzle. The streetlights cast long, shimmering reflections on the wet pavement. She opened her palm and looked at the little bird again. It was so simple, yet it felt like the most precious thing she owned. It was a symbol of an unspoken understanding, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of alleys, in the most broken of souls, there is still a capacity for gratitude, for beauty, for connection. When the bus finally arrived with a hiss of its brakes, she got on, paid her fare with the last of her change, and sank into a cold plastic seat. As the bus rumbled through the sleeping city, Lila leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. The little wooden bird held tightly in her hand, a small, solid anchor in the vast, uncertain sea of her life. She was still tired, still worried, but she was no longer just a victim of her circumstances. She was a person who had made a choice, and that choice had changed the tenor of her night, and perhaps, in a way she couldn't yet understand, much more than that. The next day, Arthur was there again, sitting on the same bench, and the day after that, he became a silent part of Lila's routine. She would save a portion of her lunch for him, a sandwich, a cup of soup, an apple. She would bring it out to him during her break, and they would sit in a comfortable silence. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in single words or short, clipped phrases. But his eyes started to change. The hollowed-out look was slowly being replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He observed everything: the way Lila tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the way her smile brightened when she talked about Maya, the deep weariness in her posture at the end of a long shift. He was a keeper of her secrets now, just as she had been for the diner patrons. She told him about Maya's upcoming school play, about the leaky faucet in her apartment that she couldn't afford to fix, about her dreams of one day opening a small bakery, a place filled with a warm, comforting scent of fresh bread, a dream she had shared with David. Arthur would just listen, nodding occasionally, his gaze steady and unwavering. It was a strange, unspoken friendship, but for Lila, it became a source of quiet strength. He was a constant in her chaotic life, a silent witness who expected nothing from her, but offered, in his own way, a profound sense of validation. She was seen. Meanwhile, in a world away from the gritty reality of the corner skillet, a sterile, glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor of a skyscraper stood empty. The chair at the head of the massive mahogany table, a throne of black leather and polished steel, had remained unoccupied for over a month. This was the office of Arthur Vance, the enigmatic and ruthless CEO of Vance Global, a sprawling empire built on shrewd investments and merciless acquisitions. His name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence in the financial world. He was a titan, a predator, a man who saw the world not in terms of people, but of assets and liabilities. The board members were in a state of quiet panic. Arthur had vanished without a word. No emails, no phone calls. His personal assistant, a perpetually nervous man named Peterson, fended off their anxious inquiries with vague reassurances. But he was just as lost as they were. The company, the behemoth that Arthur had built from the ground up, was beginning to drift, a ship without its captain. What they didn't know was that their formidable leader was currently sitting on a rain-soaked bench in a forgotten part of the city, his billion-dollar suits traded for rags, his empire for a half-eaten turkey sandwich. They couldn't possibly comprehend that the man who could move markets with a single word was now struggling to speak at all. This descent into anonymity was not a sudden madness, but a calculated act of self-destruction, a penance. The story the world knew of Arthur Vance was one of brilliant, relentless success. The story, he told himself, was one of catastrophic, unforgivable failure. 10 years ago, Arthur Vance had a different life. He had a wife, Eleanor, a woman with a laugh that could fill a room and a spirit that tempered his own sharp edges. And he had a daughter, a little girl named Lily, with his own piercing blue eyes and a boundless imagination. They were his sun, his moon, his entire universe. He loved them with a ferocity that surprised even himself, but his ambition was a relentless beast, always demanding more. More deals, more growth, more power. He was always on the phone, in a meeting, flying to another continent. He was physically present, but his mind was always elsewhere, lost in the complex architecture of his empire. He justified it to himself and to Eleanor as building a future for them, a fortress of security and wealth. But a fortress can also be a prison. He was so busy building walls to protect them that he failed to realize he was walling himself in and them out. The day it all shattered was an ordinary Saturday. It was Lily's 7th birthday. She had wanted to go to the park, to fly the new kite Eleanor had bought her, but a crisis had erupted in the Asian markets. Arthur was on a conference call, pacing the length of their sprawling, sun-drenched living room, barking orders into his phone. Lily kept tugging at his sleeve, her eyes bright with excitement. "Daddy, the kite, the wind is perfect," she pleaded. "In a minute, sweetheart," he'd said, his voice sharp with impatience, his focus a million miles away. Eleanor had tried to intervene. "Arthur, please, it's her birthday. The deal can wait." He had shot her a look of pure annoyance, a look that said, "You don't understand." He saw the hurt flash in her eyes before she turned away, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "Come on, sweetie," she'd said to Lily, her voice artificially bright. "Let's go without him." An hour later, as he was closing the biggest deal of his career, a deal that would cement his legacy, his phone rang again. It wasn't his office. It was the police. There had been an accident on the way to the park. A drunk driver had run a red light. Eleanor and Lily were gone, just like that. The universe had collapsed into a single, silent, screaming point of agony. In the aftermath, Arthur's world turned to ash. The empire he had built felt like a monument to his own arrogance. The money, the power, the accolades, it was all meaningless, a cruel joke. He had traded his family for a balance sheet. He had been on the phone chasing another zero for his net worth when his daughter had spoken her last words to him. "The wind is perfect, Daddy." The guilt was a physical entity, a monster that lived in his chest, devouring him from the inside out. He sold the family home, unable to bear the ghosts that walked its empty halls. He moved into a cold, minimalist penthouse at the top of his own skyscraper, a sterile cage in the sky. He pushed everyone away, his friends, his colleagues. He built a fortress of solitude around his broken heart, becoming the cold, ruthless caricature the world already believed him to be. For 10 years he existed, but he did not live. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the memory of a little girl with a kite and the echo of a laugh he would never hear again. He had everything a man could want, and it was all worthless. The pain was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his days, a reminder of his profound, irreversible failure. Then, one day, about a month ago, something inside him finally broke. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, looking down at the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of fallen stars. Each light represented a life, a story, a family. He was utterly, completely alone, a king in an empty castle. He realized that his wealth, his power, was the very thing that had poisoned him. It was the reason he had prioritized a phone call over his daughter's birthday. It was a gilded cage, and he was rattling its bars. He needed to escape. He needed to feel something, anything, other than the suffocating weight of his guilt. He needed to strip himself of everything that defined him as Arthur Vance, the CEO. He walked out of the penthouse that night with nothing but the clothes on his back and a few dollars in his pocket. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe punishment, maybe oblivion. He just walked until he couldn't walk anymore, until the gleaming towers of the financial district gave way to the cracked pavements and shuttered storefronts of the city's forgotten corners. He ended up outside a dingy diner called the Corner Skillet, where he sat on a bench and let the world he had once commanded simply pass him by, finally anonymous, finally free, and more lost than he had ever been in his life. Lila, meanwhile, had her own ghosts. The small apartment she shared with Maya was filled with the lingering presence of David. His favorite armchair still sat in the corner, its cushions permanently indented with the shape of him. His collection of worn-out paperbacks still lined the bookshelf. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she could almost hear his soft, steady breathing beside her. His death had been so sudden, so unfair, a brain aneurysm. One minute he was telling her a joke while they washed the dinner dishes, his hands covered in soap suds, and the next, he was gone. The world had tilted on its axis and never quite righted itself. He had left her with a mountain of medical debt and a heart full of holes, but he had also left her with Maya, a perfect, beautiful reflection of his own kind soul. And he had left her with his philosophy, the unwavering belief in the power of simple human decency. He had been a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, who found satisfaction in creating and mending. He saw the world in the same way, as something that could be fixed, one small, kind act at a time. He would volunteer at the soup kitchen, fix a neighbor's broken fence for free, always stop to help someone with a flat tire. He was a quiet, unassuming man whose legacy was written not in stock prices, but in the countless small kindnesses he had scattered throughout his life. After David's death, Lila had to be strong for Maya. She packed away her own grief into a small, tight box in her chest and focused on survival. She took the job at the diner. The hours were long and the pay was terrible, but it was steady. She learned to stretch $1 until it screamed, to patch up worn-out clothes, to make a game out of eating beans and rice for dinner 3 nights a week. Her life became a relentless cycle of work, sleep, and caring for Maya. There was no room for her own dreams, no time for her own sorrow. The box in her chest remained tightly sealed. But sometimes it would crack open. It would happen late at night, after Maya was asleep, when the silence of the apartment became a deafening roar. The grief would wash over her, a tidal wave of loss and loneliness. She would clutch David's old flannel shirt, the one that still smelled faintly of sawdust and him, and she would weep until she had no tears left. It was in these moments that she felt the true weight of her poverty, a poverty of spirit that was far more crushing than her lack of money. She was so tired of being strong. She was so tired of being alone. Her world had shrunk to the size of her own struggle, and she feared she was losing the part of herself that David had loved most, her open, hopeful heart. Meeting Arthur, this silent, broken man on the bench, had stirred something in her. In his profound emptiness, she saw a reflection of her own carefully hidden sorrow. His loneliness called out to hers. Giving him a piece of her lunch each day was more than just an act of charity. It was an act of self-preservation. It was a way of reaffirming David's most important lesson. It was a way of proving to herself that her heart had not been completely hardened by her struggle. Each time she sat with him, sharing a few moments of quiet communion, she felt a small piece of herself being mended. It was a tiny act of defiance against the cruelty and indifference of the world. She was not just a waitress. She was a woman who chose compassion. She was not just a widow. She was the keeper of her husband's legacy of kindness. She didn't know anything about Arthur's story, his past, or what had brought him to this bench. All she knew was that he was a fellow traveler on the road of human suffering. And for a few minutes each day, they were able to ease each other's burdens, simply by acknowledging them. His presence became a strange sort of comfort, a reminder that she was not the only one carrying a heavy, invisible weight. One sunny afternoon, a rare break from the relentless rain, Lila brought Maya with her to the diner. Her neighbor had a last-minute appointment, and Gus, in a rare moment of generosity, had agreed to let Maya sit in a booth and color while Lila worked the lunch shift. Maya was a ray of sunshine in the dim, greasy diner, her bright pink dress a stark contrast to the drab surroundings. During Lila's break, she took Maya outside for some fresh air. Arthur was on his bench, as usual. Maya, who had only heard about the sad man from her mother, saw him, and her eyes widened with a child's unfiltered curiosity. She clutched Lila's hand tightly. "Is that him, Mommy?" she whispered. "Yes, sweetie. That's my friend, Arthur," Lila said softly, giving her daughter's hand a reassuring squeeze. She had brought an extra cupcake from the diner's bakery, a slightly misshapen one that Gus was going to throw out. She approached the bench, with Maya hiding shyly behind her legs. "Hi, Arthur," Lila said with a warm smile. "I brought you a treat today, and I have someone I'd like you to meet." Arthur looked up, his gaze falling on the small, bright-eyed girl peeking out from behind Lila's skirt. His entire body went rigid. A storm of emotions passed across his face: shock, pain, a deep, soul-shattering grief that was so raw and palpable it made Lila's breath catch in her throat. Arthur couldn't breathe. The little girl, with her dark curls and her bright, inquisitive eyes, was a ghost. She was Lily. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, he was transported back 10 years. He could almost feel the phantom tug on his sleeve, hear the phantom whisper of Daddy, the kite. The world tilted. The sounds of the street faded into a dull roar in his ears. The box of his own grief, which he had carried for a decade, shattered, and the pain, sharp and visceral, ripped through him. He must have made some kind of sound, a choked gasp, because Lila was suddenly looking at him with deep concern. "Arthur, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. He couldn't speak. He could only stare at the little girl, this innocent catalyst who had, with a single glance, resurrected the ghost he had spent 10 years trying to bury. Maya, far from being scared, seemed to sense the man's pain with the pure, uncomplicated empathy of a child. She stepped out from behind her mother's legs. In her hand, she was holding a drawing she had made at the diner. It was a typical child's drawing, a wobbly-looking house with a bright yellow, smiling sun above it. She took a tentative step towards Arthur and held it out to him. "This is for you," she said, her small voice clear and steady. "So you won't be sad." Arthur looked from Maya's earnest face to the crayon drawing. A smiling sun, such a simple, profound offering. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated kindness, with no expectation of anything in return. It pierced through the layers of cynicism and guilt he had wrapped around himself like a shroud. A single hot tear escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He hadn't cried in 10 years. Not at the funeral, not in the empty house, not in the lonely penthouse. He had turned his grief into a cold, hard stone in his chest. But this little girl, this stranger's child, had just shattered that stone with a piece of paper and a crayon. He reached out a trembling hand and took the drawing. His fingers brushed against hers, and the simple, warm touch of a child's hand was almost too much to bear. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, his voice thick with unshed tears. He looked at Lila, and for the first time, he let her see everything. He let her see the decade of pain, the crushing weight of his regret, the profound loneliness of his self-imposed exile. His eyes were a raw, open wound, and in them, Lila saw not just a sad man, but a man who was completely and utterly broken by a grief she couldn't possibly comprehend, but could deeply, instinctively feel. That night, something shifted definitively in Arthur. The encounter with Maya had been a cataclysm. It had broken him open, but it had also let a sliver of light into the darkness. Her simple, profound act of kindness and Lila's unwavering compassion had shown him a different way of being. He had been punishing himself for 10 years, living in a hell of his own making. He had stripped himself of his name, his wealth, his identity, believing that was his penance. But he was starting to realize that true redemption wasn't about self-flagellation. It wasn't about disappearing. It was about connection. It was about taking the pain and transforming it into something meaningful. David's words, which Lila had shared with him one afternoon, echoed in his mind. Kindness is the only currency that never loses its value. He had spent his life accumulating the wrong kind of currency. He looked at the crayon drawing of the smiling sun, which he had carefully tucked into his coat pocket. It was the most valuable thing he now owned. He knew he couldn't stay on this bench forever. He couldn't keep hiding from the world, from his past. He had to go back, not to the man he was, but to become the man he could be. A man his daughter, Lily, would have been proud of. The next day, the bench was empty. Lila arrived for her shift, a small bag with a sandwich and an apple in her hand, but Arthur wasn't there. She felt a sharp, unexpected pang of disappointment and worry. She waited, scanning the street, but he didn't appear. He wasn't there during her lunch break, nor at the end of her shift. A week went by, and there was still no sign of him. The bench seemed strangely forlorn, a silent testament to his absence. Lila found herself missing their quiet companionship more than she could have imagined. She worried about him. Was he sick? Had something happened to him? Had the police finally forced him to move on? The alley felt emptier, her days a little grayer. She clutched the small wooden bird he had given her, which she now kept in her apron pocket, and hoped that wherever he was safe. She had no way of knowing that her simple acts of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that was about to change her life and his forever. She had offered a lifeline to a drowning man, never imagining he was the captain of a fleet of ships, and that he was now steering one of them directly toward her shore. Arthur Vance walked back into the Vance Global headquarters looking like a ghost from a forgotten world. His hair was long and matted, his beard untamed, his clothes little more than rags. The security guards in the marble lobby, used to seeing titans of industry in tailored suits, moved to intercept him, their faces a mixture of alarm and disgust. But as he stepped into the bright clinical light, his personal assistant, Peterson, who was rushing through the lobby, stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw dropped. He recognized the eyes. Beneath the grime and the grief, he recognized the piercing blue eyes of the most powerful man he had ever known. "Mr. Vance?" Peterson whispered, his voice trembling. Arthur just looked at him, his gaze steady. "Get me a shower, a shave, and my tailor, and clear my schedule for the rest of the week. We have work to do." The news of his return spread through the building like a shockwave. Whispers followed him down the hall. But Arthur was oblivious to them. He was a man on a mission. The time for penance was over. The time for action had begun. He was no longer running from his past. He was going to use his power, his resources, his empire, to build a future worthy of the memories he carried. Over the next few days, Arthur moved with a speed and clarity of purpose that stunned his employees. He liquidated several of his more predatory assets, companies known for their ruthless business practices, and funneled the billions into a newly created charitable foundation. He named it the Lily and Eleanor Foundation, Its mission was simple: to support single parents and underprivileged children, to fund community outreach programs, to invest in people, not profits. He was dismantling the parts of his empire built on greed and rebuilding it on a foundation of compassion. He was transforming his monument of arrogance into a legacy of kindness. His board was in an uproar, but Arthur didn't care. He silenced them with a quiet authority they hadn't seen before. The old Arthur was driven by ego and ambition. This new Arthur was driven by something far more powerful: a clear, unwavering purpose. He had found his why, and his first order of business, the cornerstone of this new foundation, was to find the woman who had shown him the way. The waitress with the tired eyes and the limitless heart, the woman named Lila. He didn't just want to thank her. He wanted to give her the chance she deserved, the chance to build her own dream, the one she had whispered to him on a rainy afternoon, a bakery that would be a beacon of warmth and hope in the community. A week after Arthur's disappearance, a sleek, black town car, the kind that never ventured into this part of the city, pulled up in front of the corner skillet. The entire diner went quiet. Patrons paused with forks halfway to their mouths. Gus peered over the counter, his eyes wide. The chauffeur, dressed in a crisp black suit, opened the rear door. A man stepped out. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the diner's monthly revenue. He was clean-shaven, his dark hair neatly cut. He looked powerful, confident, a man accustomed to being in charge. But as he turned toward the diner, Lila's heart stopped. She dropped the coffee pot she was holding, and it shattered on the tiled floor, the sound echoing in the sudden, complete silence. It was him. It was Arthur. But it was an Arthur she didn't recognize, an Arthur from a different universe. The ragged clothes were gone. The haunted, hollowed-out look had been replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He was no longer the broken man from the bench. He was someone else entirely, yet his eyes, those same piercing blue eyes, found hers across the room, and in them she saw the same soul she had shared a sandwich with in the rain. Arthur walked into the diner, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the dirty floor. The smell of grease and stale coffee seemed to hang in the air around him, a stark contrast to his polished appearance. He ignored the stares of the other patrons, his gaze fixed solely on Lila, who stood frozen amidst the shards of the broken coffee pot, her mind struggling to reconcile the man on the bench with the man standing before her. He stopped a few feet away from her. The silence in the diner was deafening. "Lila," he said, and his voice was completely transformed. The hoarse, broken rasp was gone, replaced by a deep, clear baritone that commanded attention. It was the voice of a leader, of a king. "I believe we have some unfinished business," he continued, a faint, sad smile playing on his lips. Lila could only stare, speechless. Her world had been turned upside down. Who was this man? What was happening? Gus, finally snapping out of his stupor, began to bluster. "Hey, buddy, you can't just come in here and—" But Arthur held up a hand. A simple gesture that silenced Gus instantly. He never took his eyes off Lila. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said, his voice softer now, "and I owe you everything." He then began to tell his story, right there in the middle of the Greasy Spoon diner. He spoke of his wife and daughter, of the accident, of the decade of guilt that had hollowed him out. He spoke of his empire, of the penthouse, of the crushing loneliness of a life without love. He spoke of walking away from it all, of seeking punishment on the streets. And then he spoke of her. He told the stunned diner patrons how this woman, a stranger, had shown him a kindness he thought no longer existed in the world. He talked about the half-eaten sandwich she had shared, an offering that felt like a feast. He talked about her quiet companionship, about the stories of her daughter, about her dream of a small bakery. And he talked about the little girl with the crayon drawing of a smiling sun, the innocent angel who had finally broken through his armor of grief. As he spoke, his voice thick with emotion, the entire diner was captivated. The story was so raw, so powerful, so deeply human, that the surreal nature of the situation, a billionaire in a cheap diner, faded away. There were only two people, a man and a woman, who had found each other in the depths of their respective sorrows and, in doing so, had begun to heal. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. Even gruff old Gus was wiping his eyes with the corner of his apron. Lila was openly weeping, tears of shock, of empathy, of a profound, overwhelming understanding. She finally saw the truth behind the man on the bench. His emptiness wasn't from a lack of things, but from a loss so immense it had blacked out his sun. Her heart ached for him, for the little girl with the kite he had lost. She understood now the look in his eyes when he had first seen Maya. She reached into her apron pocket, and her fingers closed around the small, smooth wooden bird. It all made sense. He wasn't just carving a piece of wood. He was trying to reclaim a piece of his shattered heart, a memory of a little girl he once carved for. Arthur took a step closer. "You didn't just give me food, Lila," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, meant only for her. "You gave me a reason to live again, you and your daughter. You showed me what true wealth is. It's not in a bank account. It's here." He gently tapped his chest, right over his heart. "You reminded me how to be human." He then laid a briefcase on the counter, the clicks of its latches echoing in the still silent diner. He opened it. It was filled not with money, but with documents. A deed, architectural plans, a business proposal. "This," he said, turning the briefcase so she could see, "is for you." Lila looked down. The documents were for a property downtown, a beautiful sunlit corner building. The plans were for a bakery, Maya's bakery, with a community space and a small apartment upstairs. The proposal detailed a partnership with the Lily and Eleanor Foundation, providing all the capital, with her as the sole proprietor. It wasn't a handout. It was an investment in her, in her dream. Lila looked up from the papers, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't understand," she stammered. "This is too much." Arthur shook his head. "No, it's not," he said firmly. "It's not nearly enough to repay you. I'm not giving you this to solve your problems, Lila. I'm asking you to be my partner. I've spent my life building an empire of cold, hard assets. I want to spend the rest of my life building something that matters. Something with warmth, something with heart. I need you to teach me how." Lila stared at the man before her, the man she had known as a ghost on a bench, and saw him clearly for the first time. He was a man remaking himself from the ashes of his past, and he was offering her the chance to do the same. This wasn't about charity. It was about redemption, for both of them. It was a chance to build a new life, a life where her dreams weren't just a fantasy to get her through the hard days, but a tangible reality. It was a chance to give Maya a future filled with security and hope. The tears that streamed down her face were no longer tears of sadness or shock, but of overwhelming, cathartic release. All the years of struggle, of loneliness, of just barely getting by, washed away in that moment. She looked at Arthur, this unlikely savior, this fellow broken soul, and she saw not a billionaire, but a friend. She nodded, unable to speak, the single gesture conveying all the hope, gratitude, and acceptance that filled her heart. A real, genuine smile, the first he had shown in over a decade, spread across Arthur Vance's face. It was a smile that reached his eyes, finally chasing away the last of the shadows. In the middle of a dingy diner, surrounded by the smell of fried bacon and the wreckage of a broken coffee pot, two broken souls had finally found their way home. 6 months later, the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon wafted from the corner of Elm and Main Street. A bright, cheerful sign above the door read, "Lila's Place," with a smaller sign in the window showing a smiling sun drawn in crayon. The bakery was everything Lila had dreamed of and more. It was a warm, welcoming space, filled with light and laughter. The community had embraced it, drawn in by the delicious pastries and Lila's warm, welcoming smile. It was more than just a bakery. It was a hub, a place where people connected. Every day, a portion of the proceeds and all of the unsold goods went to a local shelter, a program run by the Lily and Eleanor Foundation. Lila was no longer just a waitress. She was a business owner, a community leader, a woman who had found her purpose. She lived in the beautiful apartment above the bakery with Maya, who was thriving. Their lives were no longer defined by struggle, but by joy and abundance. An abundance not just of money, but of love, community, and hope. It was a world built on a foundation of kindness. Arthur was a constant presence at the bakery. He was rarely seen in a suit anymore. He preferred jeans and a simple sweater. He would sit at a small table in the corner, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the life that hummed around him. He wasn't the CEO here. He was just Arthur, Lila's friend and partner. He helped with the bookkeeping. He talked to the customers. And sometimes he would just sit and watch Maya as she helped her mother behind the counter, her face dusted with flour. In the laughter of the little girl, he didn't find the painful ghost of his past anymore. He found a gentle, healing echo. He was funding projects all over the city, building playgrounds, funding scholarships, helping families just like Lila's had been. He was using his immense wealth not to acquire more power, but to empower others. He was finally living a life that honored the memory of his wife and daughter, not by hiding from the world, but by actively making it a better, kinder place. The hole in his heart would never completely disappear, but it was no longer a hollow emptiness. It was a space that was now filled with purpose, with connection, and with a quiet, profound peace. One crisp autumn afternoon, Lila found Arthur sitting at his usual table, staring out the window. He was holding a small, intricately carved wooden bird in his hand, a much more refined version of the one he had given her. He had taken up carving again, a hobby from his youth, and his creations were beautiful. "Thinking about them?" Lila asked softly, setting a fresh croissant on his table. Arthur looked up and gave her a sad yet peaceful smile. "Every day," he said. "But it's different now. It used to be a painful memory, a reminder of what I lost. But now it feels like they're a part of this, like their love is the fuel for all of it." He looked around the bustling bakery, at the smiling faces, at Maya showing another customer a drawing. "You did this, Lila," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "You saved me." Lila sat down across from him, her own eyes glistening. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "We saved each other, Arthur," she replied. And in that simple, profound truth, the story found its gentle, perfect resolution. It was a story that had started with a half-eaten sandwich in the pouring rain and had blossomed into a testament to the enduring, transformative power of human connection. It was proof that the greatest treasures are not the ones we accumulate for ourselves, but the kindness we choose to give away.